Mary Schiavo is representing families of passengers of hijacked 9/11 planes in lawsuits against United and American Airlines.
Well, government foreknowledge is very, very important because it's clear that the government had knowledge which is imparted to the carriers. The horrible thing here is it has refused, and not in just this tragedy, for example, in Pan Am 103, it refused to impart it to the citizenry, only chose to impart it to the carriers, who then made very, very poor decisions. What was really interesting is what people thought, what the government told people and how the government acted versus the real facts. And that was something that I had found in many situations. And what people thought is on, September 10, shall we say, people assumed that planes in this country were no longer hijacked, that when hijackings occurred, it was a take-me-to-Cuba situation, that the threat for jetliners in this country was bombs in suitcases, that we had a security system. People assumed that the baggage that went into the airport, somewhere in the airport, got x-rayed and screened. People assumed that someone checked them against some sort of record and that the FBI and the CIA, the INS, and the law enforcement agencies of this country fed into the big aviation system wherever people thought that it existed. People who were on watch lists, want lists, people who shouldn't be in this country, criminals, everything from international fugitives to deadbeat dads. Zeroing in even closer to the truth of what was really going on just before 9/11 as opposed to what people think, there were 5 warnings that went from the FAA to the carriers, including one warning which specifically said that carriers could be targeted for hijacking by Middle Eastern groups. And here, again, the families have an extra heaping on them by the government of grief, because we don't have a National Transportation Safety Board investigation. We are not getting a government investigation into what happened. We are getting active efforts by the government to keep the facts and the truth from coming out. It is shocking. And we have the government, both Congress, both the legislative and executive branches, moving together to protect the tortfeasors against the dead and the injured. We have Congress moving to give the carriers bailouts and liability protections. We have the Congress imposing the fund and the President signing, giving us this fund to pay people a fee, a sum of money off of a chart, if they will agree it's a no-fault proceeding, if they won't ask any questions, if they will agree to take no answer as an answer.
Nafeez Ahmed's book, The War on Freedom, is one of the most detailed investigations of 9/11.
By June 2001, the United States was fully aware that an imminent attack was about to take place on the United States from the air. And even if they didn't have specifics, they knew it was from the air. They didn't implement any kind of security precautions at all. But what they did do was implement security precautions for their own officials. For example, Newsweek reported that on September the 10th, high-level Pentagon officials cancelled their travel plans for the next day. We have other reports, for example, that the San Francisco mayor, Willie Brown, he was told by his contact, which he describes, a security contact at the airport, told him to cancel his travel plans for the next day, and he was going to New York. So, for example, we can continue going on like this. John Ashcroft, he stopped using commercial airlines in July 2001, which is the same time where they received very urgent warnings of an imminent attack. So, even if we look at this in a minimal perspective, it is very clear that the United States government knew something was going to happen. They knew there was a threat to US citizens, but they were not interested in protecting US citizens. They were interested only in protecting themselves. The Carlyle Group is inextricably involved in September 11th in a very surprising way, because President Bush's father, who is obviously the former president, has a stake in Carlyle because he's a well-known consultant and he does speeches for Carlyle. Carlyle is a defense conglomerate. They're probably one of the biggest defense conglomerates in the United States, and they have benefited very heavily from the current militarization of U.S. foreign policy, specifically the war in Afghanistan, obviously because they're a defense company. That also means that President Bush also is likely to have benefited, which essentially means the Bush family benefited. Of course, this is a conflict of interest, but the problem doesn't end there, in that the bin Laden family also has a stake in Carlyle, which means that the bin Laden family also would benefit from the war in Afghanistan, which took place inevitably after September 11th. Now, according to the official line, Osama bin Laden has separated from the bin Laden family, and he doesn't know them, and they don't want to know him. Now, this is contradicted by several mainstream reports from ABC News, reports in the New Yorker, which actually quote FBI investigations prior to September 11th and after September 11th. Many of these investigations uncovered very specific evidence that members of Osama bin Laden's family were funding Osama bin Laden, continuing to fund him, which of course means that what we have through the Carlyle Group is a relationship between the Bush family and Osama bin Laden himself, which is very shocking. We need to put this in context. In the year 2001, world oil production peaked. This has been documented by one oil industry expert whose name is Colin J. Campbell and corroborated by many others. The implications of that is that in the following years, oil production will decline drastically. It will fluctuate, but it is ultimately declining. That means that we are basically going to face a drastic oil crisis in the coming years. So what we see in the aftermath of September 11th is an insane drive to grab as many resources as possible in order to survive and to consolidate elite power during the coming years, where we're going to have significant oil problems. According to one US military expert who was cited in the French journal Le Monde, US policy did not destroy Al-Qaeda, and in fact it flushed Al-Qaeda out into other regions of the world, which only, of course, made the situation far worse. The United States has funded the Northern Alliance and installed a Northern Alliance regime, and the Northern Alliance is now continuing the growth of opium, which basically is the prime source of funds for international terrorism, including people linked to Osama bin Laden. So the financial arteries of terrorism continue to exist as a direct result of US policy. US policy has not actually gone against Al-Qaeda or gone against international terrorism. It has exacerbated it, while at the same time securing American control of a strategic region. That is a documented fact.
David McMichael is an ex-CIA analyst and former editor of Unclassified, the magazine of the Association of National Security Alumni.
The question about how skeptical the citizen should be about the pronouncements coming from our government concerning these most recent events, I think can very well be reinforced by the revelations which were presented to us most recently during the Iran-Contra hearings and trials as to what actually was done, as opposed to the statements issued by the government, the post-Vietnam examinations carried out by, among others, the Church Committee in the Senate in 1975 also revealed a tremendous amount of very dirty linen indeed, and should have caused people to be skeptical. The thing that makes me most skeptical, frankly, is not so much to do with the story as to do with the administration's response. For example, in setting up this extraordinary Homeland Security project. Secondly, in the passage, and to the shame of the Congress, almost unanimously, of the Patriot Act, the U.S. Patriot Act, which is a barefaced assault on most of our constitutional rights. This seems to me to be wholly, uncalled for and unnecessary on the basis of what has occurred not only on September 11th but subsequently. I mean, the other big, fright, of course, was the mailing around of anthrax spores, which it now appears was probably done by some disgruntled employee of our labs up at Fort Detrick. But it's this response which I find, totally or from my point of view, unanalyzed, in sufficient manner, and the expenditure of vast sums of money and drastic rearrangement of our constitutional and governmental structure causes me to be very skeptical as to what are these people doing and why are they doing it. So, I see some very dangerous changes coming down the road. I do not like to see them justified in terms of the threat posed by terrorism. That I don't.
Michelle Chossudovsky's research at the Center for Research on Globalization has exposed links between the Bush administration and the terrorists.
I think that the intelligence failure is not the issue. The issue is political deception. It's, in fact, the complicity at the top levels of the Bush administration in what happened on September 11th. That doesn't say that they actually ordered it, but they have agencies and entities and intelligence assets which perform on their behalf. In fact, they should ask the other question, which is far more relevant. What were the chairmen of the intelligence committees of the House and the Senate doing at breakfast in the plush surroundings of Capitol Hill with the alleged money man behind the terrorists, General Mahmoud Ahmad, on the morning of September 11? The implications are very serious because the legitimacy which the Bush administration has in the war on terrorism is the pretext for waging a war without borders, which potentially affects the future of humanity, because it could result not only in a war in Iraq, but a war which would extend in a much broader region from the Mediterranean right through to the Chinese border. Because you're dealing now with several war theaters. You've got a war theater in Afghanistan, you've got one in Palestine, you've potentially a war theater on the Indian-Pakistan border in which the United States is heavily involved because they're behind the terrorists in the Kashmiri region. They're arming the Pakistanis in terms of military aid and so on. There's been a tremendous influx of weapons. And so on. So there you have potentially a situation which could explode from the coast of Israel right through to the Chinese border, and that is something which is possible only in as much as the lie prevails. But the Bush administration must understand that the enemy of the lie is the truth. And ultimately, this administration can be defeated if the truth is allowed to prevail at the broad level of public opinion. If they want to get the truth, they have to start looking in the inner pages. They will have to read a lot of different newspapers to connect the dots between this The information is all there. I mean, all the information we get is in the news. But then we have to connect that information. I mean, the information that the chief of Pakistan's military intelligence was having breakfast on Capitol Hill on the morning of September 11, which in a sense is an indictment of the Bush administration, that information is readily acknowledged. And in fact, in the same article, they say this guy is having breakfast on Capitol Hill, but he's known to have links to Osama bin Laden. So where do you, in other words, what the press has to do is, in fact, to bring these pieces of information together, not to omit information which misleads the public, and tell the truth. And some journalists are doing that.
Mike Rupert's From the Wilderness was one of the first independent news sources to raise the issue of government foreknowledge.
How can the Bush administration say that they didn't have enough advance warning when we know that foreign intelligence services had penetrated al-Qaeda, they had done eavesdropping? This is well documented in major press stories from foreign press services. That how can the Bush administration say that they ignored warnings from German intelligence, from French intelligence, and from Russian intelligence that were specific to the point where President Putin of Russia sent personal emissaries to the CIA 2 weeks before the attack with details of the attacks? And that was reported. The Bush administration had complete foreknowledge, yet they chose to pretend that nothing was happening that they didn't know, when they clearly could have taken action, when they clearly could have put fighters on alert, when they clearly could have warned airliners, when they clearly could have put people on alert at the World Trade Center in advance and saved thousands of lives. The fact is, it's clear the Bush administration needed these attacks to rally public support, and it's not the first time it's happened in American history. We've seen very clearly this year. And in 2001, the History Channel running a series, The Secrets of World War II, they had an hour special on Pearl Harbor showing that we had broken the Japanese codes before the attack and that the Roosevelt administration chose to let the attacks happen. The motives, why? Why does it happen? Why would somebody do this? Well, first of all, if you look back into the decade of the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the major oil companies had invested billions of dollars in liquid cash, buying equity rights to the largest untapped oil and gas reserves on the planet in Central Asia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, all throughout the region. And the problem was they couldn't get their oil out. They tried to build pipelines the only way they could, which was south, across Afghanistan into Pakistan, but the Taliban was in the way. This is all very well documented, again, from the congressional record, major news stories. Al-Qaeda even went to Unocal headquarters in Texas in '97 to discuss a pipeline project. That's one major motive, an oil crisis. And the world is running out of oil. We have passed the world peak in oil production that will never be exceeded again, and the oil crises are going to get worse and worse. Another reason is drug money. Afghanistan had been the largest producer of the opium poppy in the world. And in January of 2001, the Taliban destroyed their entire opium crop, some 4,000 metric tons of the opium poppy. That took what could be up to $200 billion in liquid cash out of the world banking system. This is a tactic that's as old as history itself. Presidents, rulers of countries think in terms of percentage of losses. If we say that 3,000 people were lost on September the 11th and 2,400 were lost on December 7th, 1941, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt would easily have said those are acceptable losses to achieve the desired political result. That's the way rulers of countries think. Carl Jung said, the foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. It's time to bite the bullet and ask the tough questions, because it's not too difficult now to look and see what's ahead of us and to know that it's not very pretty.
Peter Dale Scott has written extensively about hidden agendas in U.S. foreign policy.
Brzezinski, who was a Democrat, said that it's time to demonstrate to the Europeans that they're our friends, but we don't rely on them. I think that that's a path for disaster. America needs to control the world oil system. Through OPEC, America has secured that all OPEC oil will be paid for in dollars, even if it's Japan buying from Indonesia. So this creates the world demand for dollars that prevents us from having hyperinflation, even though we go on printing these little green pieces of paper, and we don't export very much ourselves. In fact, we import a great deal more than we export. It's the oil economy of the world that maintains the stability of the dollar, and that's why people are watching the dollar very closely. It's been declining a bit. Some pessimists have been saying it could decline a lot more, and this is where I think America feels that its commitment of force in the rest of the world is a way of maintaining the credibility of dollar, and oil is the secret there. Everybody has to go on paying for their oil with dollars if the dollar is to continue to be a serious currency. Well, it's changed the society we live in. I mean, we don't have the civil rights we used to, and we've tolerated some amazing abuses, like people being locked up with no habeas corpus. I think that, I did write a long poem just in the year 2000 about how Americans have had no experience of cities being attacked, and I quoted from the book of Revelation, which the Christian right is now quoting, about woe, the great city, in 1 hour destroyed, and so on. I think that Americans have entered history, that for the first time they feel vulnerable. As a Canadian, I'm sharing in that experience, but not quite so much. I think the Americans had this sense of invincibility, and, they might be defeated in a battlefield in Vietnam, but it really was not the consciousness that these things could happen here. Of course, a century ago there was a civil war and terrible things happened here, but that's all been forgotten and now it's being remembered again. There's so much we don't know. I think I just keep an open mind. I don't have a conspiracy theory to explain what happened that day, but I think we should all keep our minds open, and in the name of understanding what our role in the world is, we have to find out what actually happened on that day.
John Judge is a member of the Washington Peace Center and has researched the post-9/11 effects on U.S. civil liberties.
War is always a lie, and it's always begun by a set of lies. Truth is the first casualty of war, said Aeschylus, the Greek, thousands of years ago. And usually the lie is a staged incident that gives the excuse for going to war. And these kind of staged incidents, which frighten people, become a way to get social hegemony and social control. I think there's tremendous opposition to what's happening here. In the few months after September 11th and the shock and the fear, they were able to get something like a national consensus. All these flags showed up. You don't see them now. And a lot of them showed up, I think, from people that were just scared, wanted a sense of being part of a broader community. Or I saw impoverished black and Hispanic people, and especially people from overseas with the flags on their cars. I felt to say, look, we're not your enemy, we're not part of this. But that patriotic fervor that they're pointing to no longer exists. The economy is in a ruin. They're being asked to go into a war that even now Congress and some of the upper levels of the Pentagon itself are balking at, going into this war in Iraq. There's nothing like a national consensus on this, and so they're just ignoring it. Alexander Haig said at one point that you can't rely on the lowest common denominator, as he called it, of public opinion in order to determine foreign policy. He said, do you know that if you went out and asked the American public whether or not they wanted to go to war, that the vast majority would say no? And he said, how are you going to determine a national foreign policy based on that. Well, I call that democracy and exactly how it should be determined. But these elitists don't run the country based on what we think. They run it on what they want, and then they build up the propaganda. And what they now have schools on this called perception management and information warfare to make sure that they get some sort of public acceptance of it. And this is exactly what Bush is doing. He's tearing the last remaining line and fabric between military and police function in the United States. He's not only militarizing the police themselves, but he's also giving the military a police role. And as such, breaking down the Posse Comitatus Acts and the bright line that was established in the Constitution between those two functions. If you want an example of police and military combined, we have one. It's called the Gestapo and the SS in Nazi Germany, and we know how it operates. And Bush, by ignoring not only international law, but also establishing frontier justice here, from the beginning talking about wanted dead or alive, which is a phrase you only use for bounty hunters when you don't want a trial. But for talking about using phrases like, we'll bring them to justice or we'll bring justice to them, equating justice with military revenge, and setting up military tribunals and extra legal situations in order to deal with trying people rather than going by any civil or open rule of law, by this tremendous push now for total secrecy to the point that we were not, as the American people, allowed to see the evidence that supposedly links the 9/11 event to these individuals. When it was shown to the British, who apparently have more right to see it than we do, even though it's our policy and our lives that are at stake, they said it wasn't enough to go to court, but apparently it was enough to go to war. And these kind of erosions of the civil liberties under the Patriot Act and other things are the beginning of the establishment of a police state here, of a complete fortress state, and it's an end run mentality. There is no way that a society has the resources or the sanity to continue to think about the worst case possible scenarios and then build a society that prevents all of them. You have to go to the source of the problem.
Reva Enteen is an executive director of the National Lawyers Guild.
The Patriot Act was passed 5 weeks after September 11th in 2001. Nobody believes that the Patriot Act was written only after September 11th. It's 352 pages. So this has been the agenda of the right wing for a long time, to really crack down on dissent and target people that they believe threatens the status quo. And of course, people threatening the status quo is protected under the Constitution. We were born of dissent, and that's what we have a right to engage in. I don't believe it's a war against terrorism. I believe it's a war against dissent. One thing that I like to tie into this is, soon after September 11th, 2001, President Bush said, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, which doesn't really leave much room in the middle, because I'm certainly not with him, and I'm certainly not with the terrorists. And it's demonizing any of us who don't carry the line of the government. And just to show how many people this government has accused of even sympathizing with the terrorists, is Senator Feingold last December was told by Ashcroft that those who question my policies are aiding and abetting terrorism. Well, if Senator Feingold can be told by Ashcroft that he's aiding and abetting terrorism by asking a question in the halls of Congress, where does it put me and where does it put you? That's what we have to be concerned about. Local level organizing. We can demand that our local governments protect our constitutional rights, which exist even in a state of wartime and national emergency. The Constitution still exists, and it is our job to protect it because the government's not doing it for us. People have to continue to demand that these hearings into what led up to September 11th be full and complete and thorough. It's a victory. It's only because of the grassroots that we have any kind of hearings into what led up to September 11th. It is a victory that there's any kind of hearing at all.
Alex Jones is a television and radio broadcaster who has publicly questioned the Bush administration's version of what happened on September 11th.
There are hundreds of questions that I would like to see the government address concerning September 11th, but just a few of them are, why were three of the top hijackers, the alleged hijackers, trained at the Pensacola Naval Air Station and at the Defense Language School in Monterey, California? Why was the mayor of San Francisco and dozens of other public officials on the record as being warned not to fly September 11th by the White House? Why did the head of Pakistani intelligence that was founded by the CIA, why was he with the House and Senate Intelligence Committee chairman on September 11th? And why did he wire $100,000 to Muhammad Atta? Those are a few key questions that need to be answered. And there are so many others. Why was Bush on the anthrax-fighting antibiotic Cipro? Why did we see some of the highest... Why have we seen so many members of the Bush White House intimately involved in the put options, the short trading of United American stock at record numbers just days before September 11th? These are some of the important questions, some of the unanswered questions around September 11th. And you're not going to see this government answer those questions. All we hear is this surface, this veneer of, oh, be patriotic, get behind the war on all these different third world countries. Get behind, cheerlead our government saying that they're going to strike first against sovereign countries. Get behind giving up your habeas corpus and posse comitatus. Get behind getting rid of every basic canon of a free society. I mean, it's like it's being sold to us like a new brand of soft drink. So, in the aftermath of September 11th, we have seen a command and control system that had already been built coming out into the open. And we see the public, who have been preconditioned to accept this police state, in many cases buying it hook, line, and sinker. Though I'm seeing a massive backlash from the left and right to the real political paradigm, and I'm seeing a massive renaissance, a huge awakening. So the aftermath of September 11th is dual. You see masses of humanity being sucked into the vortex of just mindless flag-waving patriotism as they wave their rights goodbye. But we see the inverse, or conversely, we see a massive renaissance, an awakening to the fact that we are being swallowed up by this international corporate tyranny that is the New World Order. Folks, they wouldn't be focusing all this propaganda on you and your family if you didn't have power, if you couldn't affect change. They're afraid of you. The most propagandized, brainwashed people in the country are police and military and government officials and bureaucrats, because they have to be brainwashed. They have to be conditioned that what they're doing is okay, but they're compartmentalized. You have to break the silence. You have to end the silence. You have to say, never again to tyranny. And you have to learn from history. So start studying this information. Don't believe a word I've said or that anybody said. Check it out for yourself. And then begin to educate others. And there's tens of millions of us that are already awake. What if we go out and wake up others? That's hundreds of millions. It's our job to ring the alarm bells like Paul Revere did back in 1776 against the tyranny of their day. It's time for us to believe that we can affect change and we can get involved. And one of the most important things is to support the alternative media, to support the great work of the Guerrilla News Network, the work I do at Infowars.com, to begin to support and promote through the grassroots those alternative sources. This is Alex Jones from Infowars.com, and you're watching the Guerrilla News Network, part of the InfoWar on the front lines in the fight for reality. All right. Is that good? All right.